Well, good morning. I am so excited to be here today. And I'm delighted to be here with the two of you, Dr. Selena Cozart and Professor Kristen Blankley. Let's dig in, okay? Today, I have the pleasure of working with Dr. Cozart, who's an expert and a practitioner based in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she has a depth of experience engaging in transformative race, equity, and diversity work, and has a PhD from the University of Virginia. And our friend here at Moritz, one of our most prominent program on dispute resolution alums, now a professor at the University of Nebraska Law, where she specializes in dispute resolution and arbitration in particular. So welcome. Before I turn to the two of you, I want to give you an overview of how the next 70 minutes or so is going to go. We hope this panel is engaging and interactive, both with people online and in the room. So here's what we're going to do for the next 20 plus minutes. I'm going to give both Professor Blankley and Dr. Cozart space and opportunity to share their perspective on the intersection of their work connected to race, equity, facilitation, and mediation, as grounded in their work in communities across the country, in rural communities, or urban communities, diverse communities that aren't at all diverse. Then, at about 9:35 or so, we're all going to go into breakout rooms. And maybe that's a little different for a symposium, and maybe it's not going to be perfect, but we're going to make it work. Students in my mediation clinic are going to facilitate most of the online breakout rooms. And here in the room and in some of the other online breakout rooms, we have friends of the Divided Community Project and other collaborators for this program. So thank you all for your engagement and flexibility. And in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll return to this panel because during the facilitation, students in my class are going to be keeping a collaborative Google Doc. No attributions, no names, no institutions, just ideas that respond to the questions that the three of us are going to pose to the breakout groups. And we'll react to that. So we hope you find it interactive, and we hope it gets you energized here on a Friday morning before Ohio State's spring break. So, Dr. Cozart, your symposium contribution will be published in the Journal of Dispute Resolution here at Ohio State. It's co-authored with Frank Dukes, and it's titled, I'm going to read it so I get it right, "We Don't Want Any of That Neutrality and Other Lessons from Mediating Race and Equity." I understand you anticipate discussing your collaborative work mediating between the Montpelier Foundation, Board of Directors, the Montpelier Descendants Community, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I recall vividly the Saturday after our first Juneteenth holiday, this past Saturday, or this past June, hearing the story on NPR, and I said, oh my gosh, I think that's Frank and Selena's mediation. He arrived at a power sharing agreement between the descendant community and the folks who run Montpelier and own Montpelier. It's tied up in litigation, so I don't think you're going to share all the details. But I am excited to learn about what you can share about that process and about your other work at the intersection of race, equity, mediation, and facilitation. So, Dr. Cozart, please share with us where you want to go on your path with respect to neutrality, race, and equity.
Thank you. As you were introducing me, it really made me think about that process that we went through to get to the point where that announcement was made and the story did end up on NPR. And even the title of our working document was based on a quote from one of the participants in that process. And that conversation was really an opportunity for Frank and I to think about what does neutrality mean in the face of historic oppression and harm that is served by what appears to be silence, and the neutrality that often can look like it's promoting and helping those who are already in power. And so that was where we started with that conversation about how we would work with this in our paper for this opportunity. And in the process of working, we had this celebration. We were really excited about where each entity had gotten to be able to make that announcement. And then several months later, as things are, they progress and there's steps forward and then there's steps back. And we were invited back into a process which we ultimately stepped away from, which is why we don't have much that we can say about that process outside of just those bare details that I just shared. But that inquiry into, well, what does this look like? What does engaging with organizations who are grappling with historic harms around white supremacy culture, what does that look like, and what has that looked like over the body of our work? Frank and I have worked together on different projects for about 14 years now, starting with a local engagement called UCARE, which is the University Community Action for Racial Equity project, where we work together with people from the community of Charlottesville, as well as people from the university community, to put pressure on the university to address its historical harms that it had engaged with in the community of Charlottesville. And elevating the voices of the community in that process was really important. And so what we've done in our draft is we've looked at that engagement and subsequent engagements within the community in Charlottesville with the university and with other organizations to say, well, what are some threads about white supremacy culture that we can pull from that in our learnings? How have we evolved as facilitators and conveners around these conversations in our understanding of the historical implications, even naming white supremacy and white supremacy culture, naming those things in facilitation. A lot of times we often have to consider what neutrality means for us. And that's one of the things that we're really interested in exploring in our paper, because I can just say for me, when it comes to issues around white supremacy culture, I'm not neutral about the outcome and the change that I want to see in the world. And yet it's not my negotiation. It's not my, I don't have to live with the consequences of that particular engagement like the other participants do. So what does it look like for me to be an ethical facilitator in that situation and give voice to those who might not otherwise have voice? Like, what does that look like practically in terms of how I engage with a group, or even how I set my mind to work with different groups? And so that's kind of the structure or the background of what we're trying to accomplish in the work that we're doing here in this paper, to really get a sense for what does it mean, where can we go with this? Like, where's the future of facilitation and engagement, and what does neutrality look like when there's disparate power?
This premise is fundamentally important for mediation now, for mediation and facilitation in the future. The idea of what does it mean to be an ethical facilitator based on where we perspective, how we evaluate our own neutrality, if we can be neutral, if we need to be neutral in a particular conversation. I think it's so important and so valuable. And I know some of the other contributors to this symposium have written in the past on these issues, questioning assumptions of whiteness, particularly Sharon Press and our colleague here at OSU, Ellen Deason. And so I'm particularly excited to dig into this question. And we're going to come back to it in a few minutes. But we're going to turn now to Kristen Blankley, professor of law at the University of Nebraska, to begin to highlight some of her work. She has taken a different approach, and I love these two approaches to getting towards the same issues with respect to anti-racist work. Professor Blankley and her colleague Ashley Botruba are writing on what it means to facilitate conversations around race in rural, predominantly white communities. As a quick look at their paper would point out, and look at their abstract, they're thinking not about what's happening in diverse or urban communities, but what's happening in rural, primarily white communities. And that's a lot of America. So, Kristen, I'd love for you to share with us how you're working with these communities and what your ideas are for working with them, particularly when they're often running away from conversations about race.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Love to be back at my alma mater, and so thanks for inviting me. And I've been involved in conversations about race both at my own law school. I've trained law students to have conversations about race with other law students and facilitated small groups, which is also a largely non-diverse community. And the real impetus for this particular paper was a project that Dr. Votruba and I worked on. We did a 6-month facilitation regarding police reform, and I'm really excited to hear the panel later today about police reform in a city that, like a very small city that liked to call itself a blue dot in a red state. And that was a public facilitation, which I think has different characteristics than for some of the people who are here and on this call who go into workplaces and do DEI training. I know that's part of your work, and there are different types of things to keep in mind when we're doing public facilitation versus private conversations within workplaces or communities. But and so based on that experience, Dr. Votruba and I wanted to look at what are those challenges, particularly in rural areas, in non-diverse areas, and so we were really drawing from anti-racism literature, books like White Fragility, and it's so interesting to see these concepts really come to life. The questions, the reactions to conversations about race that are, I don't see anything wrong, that are, why do I have to pay today for the sins of the past? The panel on, I was really intrigued when the Stanford panel on reparations, you mentioned the word reparations in the middle of the country, and that's a very divisive topic because people who express a view that they didn't do anything wrong might be required to pay. It's an extraordinarily difficult conversation, and I was really I was fascinated with the conversation last month, particularly as it related to reparations. And so as we deal with those types of reactions, what Ashley and I are looking at is, how do we take lessons from dispute system design? How do we take lessons from facilitation and apply those to populations that are particularly resistant? And we wanted to highlight in our paper some of the places, some of those warning flags, things that you might see, including excessive challenges to process. When people start fighting and having disagreements about these tangential pieces, like, are we following the proper process? You can tell that that's a cover. That's a cover for not wanting to talk about what is really there. And we want to give some suggestions for things that can be useful. And here I think that our work is largely the same. Our work focuses on how can people have understanding conversations where we listen to understand, not conversations where we try to respond. How do we have conversations based on curiosity? And so we take some of those lessons from other works like Difficult Conversations. And some of the things that we talk about in terms of strategies in our paper are various types of listening activities. One that I've been kind of playing around in my mind is, how do we take participants and pair them up and ask a seemingly innocuous question? Tell me about the last time you were pulled over at a traffic stop and describe that. Tell me about the last time, just tell me what it was like going to a shopping mall the last time. Tell me what it was like trying to find a birthday present for a little girl so that people can have these conversations and see how issues of race can have a wildly different effect. And so that's really what we're exploring is how do we identify those barriers to the conversation and then start to provide some ideas for moving forward.
Oh, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Dr. Kozart. This is a great start to the discussion. And before we turn to our breakout groups in just a few minutes, I want to ask one follow-up because I think Dr. Kozart, you raised the question. I think Professor Blankley started to address it, but I want to hear a little bit more from the both of you. And that's particularly what does it mean to be an ethical facilitator when we're coming from an ethical mediator, when we're coming from an anti-racist perspective, when you're not neutral with respect to the outcome. What does it mean to be that ethical facilitator? And maybe if you're comfortable, how has your perspective evolved as you and Dr. Dukes are talking about Cozart in your paper? How has your perspective evolved on that point? Would you mind starting with us?
Yeah. I'll start with saying I'm still figuring it out in terms of what that means for me. And when I think about when I started facilitating, I really had a perspective of I'm just here to bring people through a process and the outcome is on them. And while I still hold that the outcomes belong to them, I am really starting to think about how to not let historic systems of harm and privilege run the show in the name of neutrality, because a lot of times what can appear to be neutral is really just status quo. And it's really easy to kind of lean back into that because nobody with power in that situation and privilege already in that situation is going to come after you for that. So there can be this, I can say for myself, there can be this sense of just fear that there'll be repercussions for me professionally if I push against the status quo. So part of the evolution that I'm dealing with is just kind of naming that for myself and getting curious about what power do I hold as the facilitator and how am I responsible with that? So I don't know that I have any answers as much as I have more questions for myself and for the process.
First of all, I appreciate that because it is reassuring. And I think many in this room are in the same place. Many who are working on rethinking systems design for racial justice and equity have a lot of questions, and we're all struggling mightily with the answers. So, Professor Blankley, what answers do you have?
So when we look at the world of facilitation, what facilitation tells us is that we start with a goal and that there's nothing that we do as facilitators that shouldn't have a goal in mind. And I think maybe that's where we can start to frame this concept about neutrality. And so if the goal of the conversation is police reform, then that gives us as facilitators the ability to be working towards that goal. Now, if the goal is understanding, it gives us the opportunity to work towards that goal. But I think that, and this is where I think facilitation and mediation differ, in that mediation is really about solving a concrete problem with a limited numbers of parties. Facilitation, working with large groups, everything we do is goal-oriented, but the goal is defined not by us as mediators or as facilitators. The goal is defined by the group, and especially if we're dealing with public facilitation, there might be a goal already in mind. And that's where, for me, I think that we can be secure in doing the job that we're doing if we are hired by a city to talk about equity in healthcare. That there is this goal already in mind, and I think that can be a really useful frame for us.
Mr. Blankley, I need to stop turning off the microphone, but I appreciate that concrete piece of advice, using that goal as a frame. And I think that's really important to think about how we get to that goal as facilitators and potentially as mediators, and particularly within the system we are working within, and what the legacies of white supremacy, how they've structured the system, how they've structured the status quo. Dr. Kozart, one more quick follow-up. In your experience, in your work, what methods would you suggest to folks who are just considering and digging into anti-racist facilitation, digging into this work? What suggestions would you have for them to question, to challenge, to think through what the status quo is and how race is connected to that?
Where to begin? I mean, question everything, right? I would say there. And what I mean by that is really to, like, all of us have been acculturated to this system, and we all have figured out how to navigate it from where we are. And we have all figured out how to gain as many benefits from it as we can. And so when I say question everything, it's even that perspective that I know how to work the system and I know how to get the gains for myself or for others. But to be able to step back and say, is there another paradigm that I can be working from personally that might be a little risky? But that curiosity really opens up an opportunity to see other possibilities. And so that for me is kind of like a North Star. And then so using that to start to find places and spaces where there's room for that kind of inquiry. You know, so learning to bring that perspective to situations, but also to start to look for situations where that perspective is valued.
Thank you, Dr. Kozart. And Professor Blankley, to follow up from your experience, how do you help the parties in a facilitation begin to question everything and through the lens of race and anti-racism?
I think what's really important is for the participants to see each other as human beings. And so much work needs to be done at the very beginning about how do people see each other as other human beings and understand the things that they're going through. One strategy, and I do know that that Dr. Botruma mentioned this last month, but one strategy that can be really helpful is in determining what the group leadership is going to be, and by having group leadership be from various stakeholder groups. And it can be really powerful. And I know in our paper that for those of you who haven't seen the movie, The Best of Enemies, it's a really kind of concrete example of how structuring the leadership of people of different viewpoints, that when a group can see them work together, it can create some momentum. And I've seen this as well in my practice. How do we structure that leadership group? And then when the leadership group can tell the rest of the group, hey, you know, we went out for coffee last week, and everyone looks at them and like, you two went out for coffee? You don't have anything in common. But they start to understand that they're people. And I think that that's where curiosity can come from. And so that's a piece of advice that I have, is to find ways for the participants to become just real people with real family and kids that do the same thing as other people. And that can really start to open up some doorways.
Well, thank you both. This has been a great kickoff to our conversation. And we're going to take a risk, as one of you said a minute ago. We're going to go into breakout groups in the next few minutes. Again, as I said earlier, we have students from the mediation clinic who've taken the mediated live cases, who have had some facilitation training, who are going to co-facilitate conversations. They're also going to be using a Google document, which the three of us are going to watch, to take unattributed notes. No names, no institutions, no places, right? But just ideas. And then in 30 minutes, at about 10, 12 after, we're going to come back as a group, and we're going to have the opportunity to react to what happens in those breakout groups. So Professor Smallwood, if you don't mind opening the breakout rooms, and if you need help, there'll be, you can raise your hand in the Zoom room, but the students should take it away. So the Zoom rooms, I think, are opening now, and if they're not, that's okay too. They'll be open shortly. For those of us in the room, it looks like we have 4, 8, I think we could easily do 2 small groups. So perhaps if we want to take Stephanie, perhaps you might go with this side of the room, and Nancy, if you don't mind facilitating that group with Chica as your note taker. And then on this side of the room, there's a tri-facilitation of Oladeji. Jan. Oladeji may take the lead, and I believe Kitty. Is Kitty? Kitty's in the back. Kitty's going to take notes on the Google Doc for you all. So if you might move perhaps towards Chica and towards Kitty, because they have the computers. It might be a standing conversation, or some of you might sit and stand. It's not the perfect layout. It's not a modular classroom. But, I need to tell everyone what the questions are. The students know. Yeah, good job, Bill. Okay, here we are. So 4 potential questions that the facilitator can lead you through. How do you host a conversation and get folks to a conversation they don't want to have? How do you engage participants that are running away from race? What's so hard about talking about race? Number 3. What changes have you seen over time and how institutions and communities are responding to conflicts and other challenges related to race? And number 4, what strategies might work in private discussions about race compared to public policy discussions about race and vice versa? So those are 4 questions the facilitator might walk you through. We'll leave it to the group's discretion. Okay? All right. Lovely. Well, I hope you all enjoyed your conversations with the facilitators, and I am just delighted with the student notes I was seeing populate on the Google document. So thank you all for your engagement and participation. We've got about 10 to 12 minutes remaining, and we want to dig into a couple of themes that we saw. We noticed a lot of people are thinking about questioning, about curiosity, about digging into the systems, about asking about the structure, but there are 2 items that really stood out to us. The first is, should we be supportive of small change, or should we go for big change? And how do we navigate that balance when we're facilitating conversations that are focused on anti-racism, or navigate that in the tension between the participants in the conversation that say, look, we need to do more than make small steps. So Professor Blankley, I'm going to turn to you first, and then we'll go to Dr. Kozar.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is the length of these engagements. And so I think that this, while I'm a big proponent of kind of the small incremental change, listening, of course, listening is really important as facilitators. It's important for the whole group. And so the question of what do we do with the incremental change, and it might have to do with how long we are together. And so if this is a one-day diversity and inclusion training, we might have a different question than if this is a year-long public policy question or a public policy debate, and so I do think that time matters. That said, because I was first trained as a mediator, so perhaps it's because of my own personal bias, I look for the incremental change and I look for the openings, but perhaps maybe the question is more so in the listening. And that's, I can give a story of, I was talking with somebody and they were talking about critical race theory, and they didn't know what to think about it. And this was someone who I had expected to say things kind of against critical race theory. And I just asked the question, would you like to know more about critical race theory? And then it was, yes. And it was like, oh, okay. And so I think the incremental change is useful. And I think that careful listening is also a very useful skill for all of us. And that could be something we train participants to do as well, but certainly in our role as facilitator.
And thank you, Kristen. And I just note that I love, Kristen, and you're coming back to this goal in mind. When you talk about the term, that's about the goal. If you hire a facilitator for a short term, you have one goal. If you hire a facilitator for a multi-year truth and reconciliation process, that is a vastly different goal. Dr. Kozar?
Yeah, I like what you're saying, Kristen, about the length of engagement. One of the examples that I have from my own practice is that I'm working with a nonprofit organization who has as its goal to be an anti-racist organization. So we're in the process of figuring out what that means and what that looks like. But one of the things that we talk about is, how to value and evaluate change. And the thing that we talk about is this notion of having a North Star for all of the change. So whether it's big change or little change, incremental change, if you take a move and you don't have the goal, and like you don't keep it in the context of the arc that you're creating with this move, you can become very complacent, or you can start to imagine that you've done the work with this one incremental change. Or that change can end up getting co-opted for some other purpose if you don't keep the goal in mind. If you're like, for instance, with this organization, their goal is to become an anti-racist organization. So let's say in 3 months, they hire some more people of color. Okay, that's a great move, but is that being an anti-racist organization? Is it moving you along the way, or is it the goal? So sometimes things can get celebrated as if you're at the goal, as opposed to you have made progress. And so keeping that idea in mind around which is which, so that you're not celebrating the wrong thing.
The North Star, and keeping that North Star in mind, that really resonates with me as I'm thinking through work that facilitators might do in anti-racist work or otherwise. What's your North Star? I think it applies globally, but particularly to anti-racist focused conversations. The other reaction, the other item we noted, and we wanted to get your reaction to. First of all, we drafted 4 questions. No one went to question 2, 3, or 4. That's fine. Clearly, question 1 was sufficient, and we really appreciated seeing all the comments. So Ahmad captured this quote: "The fear that arises from communities that know what happens to people who challenge the system." This is one of the reasons why folks might run, we presume. We weren't in this breakout room, but this is one of the reasons why folks might not come towards a conversation around race. So Dr. Kozar, maybe you'd start us off reacting to that and turn to Professor Blankley.
Yeah, there can be fear because, the status quo, everybody kind of understands what that is and what we're working toward. And yet that fear doesn't have to be the last word. Or, as a facilitator, I think you need to keep it in mind what context you're working in and that people have these reactions. So the question is, how do you create the atmosphere so that this is once they're in the room, Kristen's working on how to get them in the room. Once they're in the room, how do you create the space that is safe for engagement to even have the incremental change that we talked about previously? I think that as a facilitator, you do have to keep in mind that people are coming from a context, they're within a context, and that, they have a stake in it. And so recognizing that you can have that fear, that doesn't have to be the last word on the process.
Everyone is coming from a different lens to a process. And that the note about fear that it doesn't have to be the last word when they're within the process. I think it's really valuable to think through from a perspective as a facilitator, or from the students who are on the conversations there from their perspectives, mediating the conversation. So, Kristen, we want to get your reaction to this quote as well.
From a process piece, and we were talking and chatting a little bit about this during the break, is how do we structure or vary the process to alleviate the fear? And one thing that could be done, and in my practice, I've had varying success with this, but one common facilitator technique is let's just meet with everyone privately and see whether or not that's the right space. That's the place where people, that fear can be lessened. Whether if we're working in the public sphere, we've got some extra questions about, can we meet with people privately? If we meet with people privately, what happens there? But even outside of the one-on-one, and I saw this in some of the Google comments, was how do we structure maybe small group? How do we perhaps do anonymous surveys? I have Dr. Botruba and I have worked with Google Docs, same as you here, to ask survey questions to get the anonymous answers. And that might be a way to signal for the group that there are problems, but without attribution. And so I think dealing with mixing up participation formats and ways to participate without attribution can be useful to give us space. It's not foolproof, of course, and there's always concerns that the group might be able to figure out who that is, but we do the best we can.
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, particularly, it sounds like you're trying to lower the risk for participants in the conversation, lowering the risk about their candid comments. One of the other parts that we noted in the chat that we talked about was fear of getting it wrong. There are consequences in communities for diving into a race-focused conversation and potentially being canceled. And then this fear of getting it wrong. So perhaps ways to lower the risk might help people enter the conversation, might help people engage in a more deep, rich, and meaningful way into a conversation. I want to go back to this quote, though, from that Ahmad noted, and just highlight a little bit of my perspective on the fear that arises in communities that know what happens to challenge folks who challenge the conversation. And I think even folks who are coming from a place of privilege, folks who are coming from academic institutions, who I've heard some reluctance to engage in conversations that focus on race, focus on anti-racism work, focus on legacies and legacies of racism and institutional trauma. And I think they're afraid for their career paths and career trajectories, but they're holding some privilege. They're exceptionally privileged to be in the position that they have. And I wonder if either of you have any advice for folks who come from a place of privilege, but are reluctant to lean in because of that fear, are reluctant to facilitate a conversation focused around race because of that fear. I'm wondering if you have any advice, because they've seen what happens to people who challenge systems. They might no longer be employed. So I wonder if either of you have any advice for those people who know they have the privilege, want to do good, but are afraid of the powers that be, are afraid of the status quo in the systems they operate in.
That's such a good question. And what I would say, back to the idea of incremental change and the value of that for that person who is afraid to take risk, to find a manageable risk that they can take. That everything doesn't have to be the large splash, but it can be an opportunity for you to gain your own confidence around what you can say, what you can't say, and also to start thinking about, well, what is my power for? What is my position for? What is it that I'm here to do with this opportunity other than preserve it?
What is my power for? Other than to preserve it. Internal thoughts in the room. Kristen, to you.
So I think about organizational change a lot, and I've done organizational facilitations in contexts other than race, and there's a concept that seems to work decently well outside of the world of race, that I wonder if it would work within the world of race, and that is, if most of the organization moves one way, can we just leave them now? If most of an organization or most of a community moves in the way towards the goal, maybe what we're changing is that risk calculus. Maybe it's the question of, do I want to be over here on an island by myself while everybody else has moved away? And so that's maybe a different approach to that same question. And so then by not engaging, those individuals have taken the risk to be isolated.
So shifting the risk from engaging to the risk of not engaging. I like that idea. I want to think more about that. We are right at time, but we started late. So we'll be okay. And I want to give each of you the opportunity for a 30-second concluding thought. And while you're thinking about that, I want to tell everyone on the Zoom chat that we are actually leaping over to webinar mode for the duration of the day. So those of you who are on the Zoom chat, we are likely to drop that webinar into the link. Carl's done it already. Please click that link. It's not open yet because the same person can't host two things at the same time, but it will be as soon as this panel's over. So, Professor Blankley, 30 seconds.
Well, I just wanted to thank you all for this. I have felt that this particular presentation was a big risk for me. This is my first time talking publicly about and writing publicly on issues of race. And I want to thank you all for being supported in this endeavor and for kind of taking me where I am. And I'm trying to doing my best to take you all where you are. And so I just want to thank you for this opportunity and for and for kind of challenging me to do this and allowing me to do it.
Thank you, Professor Blankley. Dr. Kozar, last word to you.
Yeah, I want to express my thanks as well. Just the opportunity to be among colleagues that are thinking deeply about these things.
And thank you both, Professor Blankley and Dr. Kozar. This has been a lovely start to the day. We'll see you all in the next Zoom link.